On today's episode of Mrtriton, we're installing a ARB diff breather kit. Let's get stuck into it. So let's talk diff breather kits. What is a diff breather kit? What's the whole idea here? So in terms of diffs, as you know, they have breathers to vent pressure as the oil and the inner workings of the diff heat up. There's an amount of pressure that builds up and it has to be released, unless there is a breather. Unfortunately, manufacturers put the breather down low. And for everyone's sort of day-to-day use of a vehicle, that's not necessarily going to cause any problems for them. If you're driving in the street, if you drive through a little bit of water on the road, it's probably not going to cause that much of an issue. Problems arise when you get to water that is of a considerable depth, that water that will fully submerge your rear diff and also submerge the breather. Why is it of particular importance to install breather kit? It's got to do with sort of metallurgy. Obviously metal heats up and sort of expands, and metal gets cold and it contracts. You've been driving on the highway for a while, you've been driving down a full drive track, 40-degree day, things are heating up, the oils and the diff are heating up, all the components are warm and being run. Now you don't want to drive through a water crossing or water obstacle when your engine is hot. Generally what they recommend, and I probably recommend as well, is if you've just been coming off a sand stretch, for example, and the revs have been high, the engine temps are hot, you want to pull over for a couple of minutes, just let things cool down a bit, have a bit of a lunch break, start your vehicle, go through the water straight after you've sort of started your vehicle. That way things aren't really hot, and that way you don't crack your engine block and damage some of those more sensitive components. The same thing applies for your rear diff and also front diff and other parts of your vehicle too. Everything's hot and expanded, and when you go through that water, the diff will contract. Now, the issue here isn't necessarily that the diff will crack or you'll do physical damage per se. The issue here is that, like a syringe, when the diff is hot, the breather is letting out pressure. When the diff contracts, when that cold water or the water rapidly cools it down, it causes that breather to suck water into the diff. Now, why is that something to be concerned about? Now, obviously, in the same way that it's important to choose an engine oil that is appropriate for your vehicle, it's also important to choose a diff oil that's appropriate for your vehicle, an oil of the right viscosity. That way things are adequately lubricated. And when you go through that water crossing and you suck water into your rear diff, mixes with the oil, and sort of the viscosity is altered. It's not properly lubricating the inside or inner workings of the diff. You may also end up with some corrosion, and if you've seen oil, coolant, or water mixed together, you end up with like a very weird substance, a foamy substance that doesn't resemble oil. So it's important to make sure that your vehicle components are adequately lubricated, and when you don't have a diff breather and you go through the water, you're going to inadequately lubricate because you're going to have water mixed with oil, or more water than oil might displace the oil. So this is why I'm installing a diff breather. Now, a kit like this will set you back $100, and the whole idea here is, as I've mentioned, you've got your diff breather at the low position that it sits from the factory, and when you raise the height of your diff breather inlet higher than what it is from the factory, you're going to prevent it from being submerged in water, and you're going to prevent water from getting in. Obviously, when you go through water, your diff will still contract as that metal rapidly cools, but it's going to be sucking in that air from a higher point. Water doesn't get in. There's all kinds of kits out there. Superior Engineering do one. There's other cheap brands that do them. Why have I chosen ARB? It's just simple, easy, cheap for me to get at the time. Many other kits will come with 4 hoses and 4 outlets. This ARB kit only comes with 2 hoses for your front and rear diff, and later on you can actually buy additional hoses and connect it to the kit and plug it into your transfer case. Exactly the same thing with your diff applies with your transfer case and other parts as well. It's a lubricated component, has a breather, go through the water, suck in the water into the component, inadequate lubrication, and wear and tear, damage to the vehicle, etc. So from here, we're going to open up the diff kit, have a look at what's in it, I'll explain what parts do, and we'll get stuck into the installation. Here we have our diff breather kit from ARB. Obviously I've opened it to see what's in it to make sure it's all there. Here's how we're looking. This is our intake. So what you do is you want to mount this in your engine bay, and you've got the same type of little alloy filter or metal filter that they have with their ARB air compressors as well. We've obviously got our hose here as well. With this here, you've got 4 inlets to the filter here. So what you do is obviously you've got 2, so 1 for your diff at the rear, 1 for your diff at the front. You've also got 2 more so that later on you can do a breather for your gearbox and transfer case or whatever they are. Unfortunately, this kit only comes with the diff breathers, but I'll grab more hoses later on to do the other components, because otherwise you've only done half a job. We've got our blanks here. So the blanks will go in one on either side, and then you'll have your hoses coming in the other side. So you've got a bit of a seal here, or you close it up. Not necessarily a seal, but it also just prevents from muck and dirt from getting into your hoses. Now, what is a little bit shonky here, and I would compare it to the way that I would do things myself, is these. Obviously what we do here, when we unscrew the filter component, is you're going to screw this to somewhere in your engine bay or a part of your vehicle that is not exposed to, water. But what are you going to do here? You're just going to screw this like straight into the body of your vehicle. It doesn't go in very far, but still it's a bit shonky. And if you just screw it straight in, you're going to want to paint it so it doesn't rust and that sort of stuff. But we'll go by the instructions and see where it gets us. Now, the instruction manual outlines a number of ways that we can set up this breather kit. If you're going to go with only diff breathers, so you've got an existing other transfer case and whatever breather kit installed perhaps, what you would do is you could do it similar to this image. So what you've got is you've got your filter bolted in on this sort of angle, and you're planking off the upper or top inlets, and then you've got your 2 hoses coming in from beneath as outlined in this image. Obviously you can also go, put it on the side angle and have 2, 1 coming in from either side, or if you've got 4 breathers coming in, so you've got both your diffs, transfer case, gearbox, whatever, then you can have all 4 coming in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go for this style of mounting point or mounting. So we're going to have it like this as opposed to this, and what we're going to do is we're going to blank off 2 of the sides. We're going to have both breathers coming in from either side there, and later on I can use an Allen key, remove the blanks, and run a hose going into each of those inlets at a later stage. So we're going to start with our blanks, and it doesn't really matter what side you put them on, it's just your personal preference. But see if we can line up that thread. There we go. And that's hand tight, so good enough for now. We'll go through and tighten that up after somehow. I don't think that'll let in any any water like this. And we're going to work out where we're going to mount this. So we'll screw these in now, and we can have a play with things later. But what we'll do is chuck it on. This is a 13. It's nice and tight. We'll do this one as well. Now, the reason I'm screwing these on now before we actually mount this into the vehicle is, imagine if you attach the hose to one of these connections and you've got to try and screw it on, and you've got to try and twist the hose while it's under the vehicle. Things are going to get twisted and tangled, and it's going to be a mess, and it's going to be impossible to do. Additionally, once this is mounted in the vehicle, we're going to have a hard time getting a little spanner or socket onto this little component here. So, personal recommendation, screw it on and assemble your little filter prior to mounting in your engine bay or wherever you want to put it, and yeah, save yourself some. So now that our filter component is fully assembled, we're going to run our cables from our diff to the engine bay, and we're going to work out where the easiest place is going to be to then mount this. If we mount this, then we've got to try and work our way to this. I think logically for me, we want to connect this up first, see how far you can get it, and yeah, once you've done that, then you can mount this in the engine bay somewhere that's convenient. Now, unfortunately, somebody thought it would be a good idea to cover all of this in grease to stop it from rusting. What moron would come up with that, eh? I'd hate to be the mechanic who's got to deal with this next time they service it, but she's a bit caked up there. Alright. It's worth noting also that there's no rust here. since I went through and did all that rust treatment, there's nothing. Like, it's looking good. So just sticky. All right, this is a bad angle. So here we've got our factory diff breather here, and I'm not 100% convinced that this is going to be compatible. So I'm going to remove this plastic cover and we're going to see what's underneath it. So I've removed the stock diff breather and found that it uses just like a hose insert, bit of plastic, just sort of pop it in. They do sell kits that have these that are threaded to facilitate one of these hose connections. You get a little spring valve thing here that is supposed to relieve the pressure, but when I actually removed this diff breather, there was like an explosion of pressure that just burst out the rear diff. So it's somewhat concerning that this factory valve wasn't relieving the pressure. What we're going to do is going to remove the top little nozzle bit, and we're going to see if there's a way that I can thread this into this piece of plastic. I'm going to open up this vise and we're going to gently insert this. It's very easy to crush and damage this. It's quite strong, but you'd crush it easily with a vise. A little wider, and what we're going to do is going to put a gentle clamp on this so it's flush though. So that's not going anywhere. Well, it's going somewhere, but there, nice and strong. And we're going to hacksaw this component. Plenty of space here. That's nice and thick for a thread. So now I'm going to file this flush. Alright, this is where we need to be very careful, because if we take too much meat out of here, we're screwed. So we have a drill on slow settings. I'm not going to go all the way through because that'll still leave us plenty of meat there to use. There we go. Take it easy. Gently threading. Downwards pressure. It's found its thread. It's tightening up slowly. And there we have it, guys. Blow it out so that we don't get any of that plastic inside the diff. What we've got here, you can see it's threaded in nicely. It's not really twistable by hand. I reckon that worked pretty well. So I'm trying to get a good angle of this for you guys, but it ain't easy. What we're going to do, I'm going to have this bloody hose, is we need to put it in this big old hole here. I'm going to use the camera to guide me in. That is in there, nice and flush, as you can see. So what we want to make sure of also is when we do cut this hose, we want to make sure that we've got enough slack, because this diff will articulate as we travel over those off-road obstacles. So don't cut the hose until you've got it all the way to where you need. Do a bit of a calculation in your head, work out your slack, good to go. Now there are a number of places that you could mount this little piece here for the filter for your breather kit, but what we're going to do is I've removed my air compressor and we've got this little bracket here. The air compressor bracket that I had made up is too thick. It's a big chunky thick piece of steel. The little screws that ARB have given us aren't deep enough, and they're also not strong enough to penetrate and self-thread into that steel. So what we're going to do is there's a bracket here. So we're going to screw this onto the bracket and do it the other way around so it's easier for access for the hoses. But basically we'll mount it here. This is only being held on by two little 10 mils here. I've taken one off to remove the air compressor because that's where I mount it. I'll remove this bracket here, it'll pull straight out, and I'll disconnect the wiring there as well. Jesus. So what we're going to do now is we're going to remount this little sensor or unit here to the bracket. We're going to bolt this back down. We're going to reinstall my air compressor, and we're going to run the diff breather hose up to the filter here. Alrighty, so breather filter is installed in the engine bay. We've installed the hose to the rear diff just down here. What we're going to do now is probably the easiest sort of part of this whole installation, which is run this airline underneath the car up to the diff breather. So far we've run the hose from diff up along above the suspensions, so it doesn't get caught up in any of that. It's all the way from the drive shaft and exhaust, so it's all safe, following a similar line to that of the brake lines. We've gone over this center beam here. I've noticed that this grommet here has come out. That allows you to access the interior of the vehicle underneath the passenger's seat, I believe. So that's useful information for if anybody's looking to, run any wires, cables, etc. What we're going to do is we're going to continue our journey along the chassis. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue our journey along the chassis, going all the way down and then up into the engine bay. This is messy, messy work. Okay, so we've got the right length of hose here. We've got plenty of slack going back to the rear diff. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut the hose cleanly, hopefully. It's a nice straight cut. Okay, it's nice and clean. Take the end of the hose, give it a squish to re-round it, and we're going to push it back down a little bit. We have a little bit too much excess, but that's okay. Then I'm going to plug it into the bottom one. And then we have the first hose plugged into our little breather here. Next step is we're going to find where the breather for the front diff is, do this whole process again, and run what cable we have left from the front breather to the filter section. So I think I've found something very bad underneath my vehicle right now. I was having a suss of the front diff to find where the breather is, and I found a bit of a weep coming from the front diff. It's possible that I've bottomed out somewhere on an off-road track or something. If so, maybe I've cracked my diff. It's a very negligible amount of oil weep. In fact, I've never even seen it drip onto the concrete. So from here, I think I'm going to remove the front bash plate, clear out a bit of the dirt that's there, open it right up, and just sort of open it up and sort of see what's going on around that diff area, give it a wipe down, work out where the weep is. Might be in for a new diff, who knows? Let's have a look. So what we've got here is a significant amount of weepage coming from the front diff here. And this bash plate has obviously copped a massive impact here. I remember bottoming out quite significantly at Jacob Farm the other week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off this bash plate. I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to try and work out where this weep is coming from. So what we'll start with is we'll determine the size of these. I think it's a 12. Yep, cool. So what we'll do is we'll chuck a 12 on here, get the impact, rip this bash plate off, and see just how bad it looks underneath. Great. Oh, it's rounded. So this just keeps getting better. The rear right bolt, whatever, for the bash plate, the rear bash plate, not the front bash plate, has rounded. On a 2.5-year-old car, the bolt's rounded. Explain that to me, because I don't understand. But anyway, rust, exposure to the elements, it's rounded. So what we're going to need to do is probably leave that on and just let it flop, and we're going to get under them, we're going to clean it up as best we can and have a bit of a look. It doesn't look like it's cracked. It looks like the bash plate has been pushed up and impacted the bottom of the diff housing, and that sort of face of the diff, whatever you want to call it, diff cover, I guess, looks like it's been bent somewhat. And so that's potentially, because it's the way it's sort of folded up or bent up a little bit, relieved some pressure on the gasket, and therefore we have weepage. Generally with a significant crack, you'll have pools of oil on the driveway, concrete, whatever. I've noticed a single thing. Bash plate's there, but even still, if it was significant, it would overflow, pour over the bash plate, and you'd have a bit of a patch somewhere. So getting under there, cleaning it up, and getting a visual representation for myself as to where that's coming from. If this is the case that we have actually cracked the diff, well, that's a new diff, and that's very expensive, and I'll take you on that journey. If, however, I've just bent the lip up, what I'll do is I'll clean it. I'll try and whack that sort of diff cover back into shape with a bit of a sort of hammer and screwdriver situation, and we'll see whether that new clamping works. If I've damaged that diff cover to a point where it needs to be replaced, I'll replace it with something much more heavy duty. Unfortunately, that entire assembly of full drive actuator, front diff in an Mrtriton is extremely exposed, in that it's behind a bash plate, but if that bash plate is compromised, it's completely exposed. And we're talking 2 mil of like steel for the bash plate. It's very insignificant. I reckon they should have at least put something a bit thicker and more sturdy. Just looking at this design, it looks like there's so many better ways to do it. Anyway, let's have a look. So here we have it. We've got like our little full drive solenoid actuatory mabob here. Just behind this little like 2 mil thick, this 2 mil thick bash plate is very insignificant. And obviously I've caved it in pretty bad somehow. I mean, if you think a couple ton of vehicle falling down on a bash plate would damage it. I'll clean this up, but you can see barely, just here, there's a bit of a bend on this cover of this front diff, and they've gone with a very thin, surprisingly thin metal cover on the front of this diff here, but it's bent up. So I suspect, hopefully, as opposed to a crack, we've got a bend, and we just need to recompress it after we've cleaned it, or maybe even a new gasket, and that should fix the leak. This is our point of impact here. You can see where the bash plate is actually pressed up against that cover. So I reckon that, and it's some wiping down, should give us a good indication of where the problems are. So aside from this issue we've had, everything's gone quite smoothly. In fact, I found that, from what I can tell, and don't hold me to this, you don't actually need a diff breather for the front diff of the Mrtriton, because like other models of Triton, the breather already sits quite high up, actually in the engine bay at the same height as the breather that we've just installed, if not higher. We have a metal hose or tube, I guess you'd say, coming up from the front diff, and I'll show you where it comes out. So you'll notice there's a bunch of metal pipes coming up, but in fact this here, I believe, is your breather for your front diff. It's got a little valve on top, so it can relieve pressure already. What this means is that we can leave that as it is, and we can use the piece of hose that we currently have, that we were going to use for the front diff, for our transfer case or our gearbox, which is good because we can, an extra part of the vehicle is protected from water ingress. So based on the fact that we don't need to install a diff breather for the front diff, so far as I understand, because it's already got a breather up high, and we've completed the diff breather installation on the rear diff, I've had a bit of a recce, had a bit of a look, and I honestly do not think that I will be able to physically reach the breather for the transfer case, gearbox, whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it there. Rear diff breather installed, front diff breather is already dealt with, and I think I'm going to need to get the other breathers installed professionally, because without disconnecting the driveline, maybe even dropping the transmission, there is physically no way I can fit my arm in. I mean, as you can see, I've tried extensively to get both my hands up between the body of the car, firewall, and transmission, and it is just not going to happen. Honestly, I have no idea how one would connect breathers to these. I mean, you'd have to disconnect the driveline, you'd have to maybe even drop the transmission. It is a abysmal task trying to get in there. So like I said, what we're going to do, they give us a third blank. We're going to remove one of these from the filter assembly, insert the third blank, and I guess, you know, I'm not really going to want to tackle many water crossings given that I don't have a breather for my transmission. The whole idea is to protect the driveline and everything like that, and if we're protecting a rear diff but we're not protecting the trans, what are we to make of that, you know? And that's it, guys. Hope you've enjoyed the video, hope it's been helpful. I will let you know how the front diff goes in terms of how it eventuates, what was wrong with it, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.